If a doctor tells someone you love, perhaps even yourself, that you have cancer and will probably only have 6 months to live, you don't say, "Oh, that would be terrible, I would hate that, so it can't be true." You need to look at the evidence as to whether that is true or not. That's what I want to do. Now, when we're talking about God, of course, that concept can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Since this is a Christian institution, since I know that Dinesh D'Souza is a Christian, and since we are living in a society that is Christian in its culture, I'm essentially going to talk about the Christian or the Judeo-Christian conception of God. And that's the being that I think I can claim does not exist. There may be other things in the universe people can talk about, some vague life force or whatever, which it's much more difficult to prove or disprove the existence of such a being. But of the Christian, the Judeo-Christian God, I think we can be clear that that being does not exist, and the reason we can be clear about that is by looking at the world around us. The world around us contains an immensity of suffering. As far as we know, it always has contained, as long as there have been sentient beings, which goes back many millions of years, an immensity of suffering. Can we really believe that a God who is described as all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good has created such a world? I think this is the major stumbling block to belief in the Christian God. It's always been, for me, the thing that has made it impossible for me to believe in such a God. A God who deliberately and knowingly created a world like this one could not be a good being. We might say either this kind of God was evil or this God was a bungler. There are no other options. But Christians, of course, deny either of those alternatives. Now, this is a very old argument, of course. I'm not saying anything at all novel. You all know it. You're probably all familiar with it. Despite the fact that it's an old argument, generally Christians have not had very satisfactory responses. And I think, in fact, that Dinesh also, in his book, What's So Great About Christianity, does not say anything very much about it. He has a very few pages on this topic at all, and really only gets to the tough problem in a paragraph or two, which, not surprisingly, is not satisfactory. What do Christians usually say about it? Well, the most common response, I suppose, is to say, yes, there is suffering in the world, but there is suffering, and Dinesh, in fact, listed a lot of this suffering in the crimes of the atheists that he talked about, some of whom maybe were not actually all atheists, but anyway, talked about the things that people have done. And so most Christians say, well, God gave us free will. Free will is somehow seen as a great gift, as something that is essential, and indeed the importance of which in some way overrides all the suffering that Dinesh mentioned, and indeed all the suffering that humans have created in the world. Now, I think we might question whether giving humans free will is worth it, given what many of them have done with their free will. But let's just leave that. Let's just accept that claim, if you like. Let's just accept that somehow it was so important that we should have free will, that God could give us free will knowing in advance that the Nazis would murder 6 million innocent people, that Stalin would murder 20 million innocent people, that Pol Pot would murder 20% of the population of his country, and so on and so forth. Let's assume that God nevertheless did that. It is still the case that there is a lot of suffering in the world that is not explained by this, because there is a lot of suffering in the world that is nothing to do with anyone's free will. We all know that, we've all seen it. We've all seen natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, droughts, diseases, which strike people down, cause them to suffer, cause them to die, sometimes horrible, agonizing deaths, drawn-out deaths, or cause them to live in unspeakable afflictions, agony, constantly hungry or thirsty because of a drought, perhaps, that has caused crops to fail. And we can't explain that in terms of free will. It has nothing to do with free will. Nor can we explain it in terms of saying that we are fallen, as Christians tend to say, and therefore none of us are innocent. Because even if you believe that, and let me say, I think it would be a totally monstrous doctrine to believe that God would create a world in which, let's say, a 2-year-old child would die a slow and lingering death from hunger and thirst because that baby's alleged ancestors, Adam and Eve, sinned. Again, I would think that would be a monstrous God who could make a baby suffer for that reason. But even if you still think that, even if you still think that the suffering of that baby is somehow deserved because of original sin, what about the suffering of non-human animals? They also die slow, miserable deaths through droughts or hunger or disease or a variety of other causes. And not even Christians believe that they suffer from original sin. They're not descended from Adam. And that suffering has been going on even longer than human suffering because they've been sentient beings, sentient animals, for even longer. I think it's inexplicable on the Christian account of the world that animals should suffer in those ways. And I have to say, I could not possibly worship, I could not possibly revere a God who did that. If somehow it were proved to me that there is such a God, an all-powerful God, my attitude would have to be one of contempt and defiance, whatever it cost me. I think I would not have any integrity if I worshipped such a God simply because he was all-powerful when he was such a monster. Now again, of course, some Christians have been aware of all of this that I'm saying. What do they say? Well, actually, the only answer that seems to me even remotely to really answer the question was given by René Descartes, the 17th century French philosopher, who said, well, this is a big problem. This is a terrible problem, animal suffering, for belief in Christianity, but I have the answer. I can solve this problem which no one else can solve. And you know what his answer was? His answer was, animals don't suffer. They're just machines. He said, look, your clock makes a noise, but that doesn't mean it's conscious. It's just a machine. Animals are machines made by God. A bit more complicated, of course, because God made them, not just us. So the noises they make, the fact that they cry out or yelp or whine when they're hurt, doesn't mean that they suffer. They're just complicated machines. Well, if you can believe that, okay, you can get away from the problem of evil. But I don't think many people who live with a dog or a cat or know anything about animals could possibly believe that. And I don't think there's any other plausible solution to the problem of evil. Okay, let me just say a few more things in the time that I have remaining. If somehow I were to come to believe in God, I could still not possibly think that the account of Jesus as given by the Gospels is an account of a being who I would want to regard as part of God or the Son of God or whatever particular view of the Trinity you may hold. It seems to me clear that the Gospels present an image of a person who, firstly, was mistaken about the future, deeply mistaken about the second coming. It must be evident, I think, to anyone who reads the Gospels and takes them at all in their obvious face value meaning, that Jesus believed the second coming would occur in the lifetime of those, or some of those, to whom he was speaking. He says it on several occasions. You can find it in Mark and Matthew. I'm sure many of you will know the verses better than I do. That some of you here will not have tasted death before the coming. It didn't happen. Take it that's not news to any of you. It didn't happen. Paul also said something similar, clearly expected it to happen. It didn't happen. Christians have been saying it ever since. It didn't happen. Christians are still saying it. They're constantly setting new dates for when it's going to happen. It doesn't happen. Well, I'm not focusing on the current Christians, but Jesus clearly was mistaken about that. And if you want to take the gospel seriously, then I think you have to admit he was wrong. Of course, you could have some figurative interpretation of it. He didn't mean it literally. But once you do that, anything goes. Once you have those kind of metaphorical interpretations of the Gospels, we can all argue about the messages of the Gospels in a variety of different ways. Let me also say that I think the image of God given in the Old Testament is, if anything, considerably worse. The God in the Old Testament seems to quite openly embrace exactly the crimes that Dinesh accused atheists of carrying out, namely genocide. Have a look at Numbers 31, if you don't believe me. It's not something that's probably read regularly in church. But God tells Moses to strike against the Midianites, people whose women have been sleeping with some Israelites and have led them to worship the Midianite god. So the Israelites arm themselves, they go out, they attack the Midianites, they kill all the Midianite men, they carry off their cattle, they burn their villages, and then they bring the women and children back in front of Moses. And Moses, who's been instructed by God on what he should do, gets angry with them and says, "What? Did you spare the women? They're the ones who induced our Israelites to worship the false gods. So kill all the women who have known men," all the non-virgins, in other words. Kill them all. And kill all the male children. Slaughter all the male children, who are completely innocent, obviously, small children. The only ones you don't slaughter are the virgins. Them take for yourselves. That's what God instructs the Israelites to do. Can we seriously worship such a God if we believe in him? I think it's better to regard this as a kind of a myth, a fairy tale, national stories made up by a warring primitive tribe than the revealed Word of God.